Hello, everybody. This is Mike, and today I'm going to cover what might not be the most popular topic, grief. It's something that many of us try to avoid. It's not something that we enjoy, but it is something that eventually all of us go through. So I want to talk about grief. I want to talk about what it is and what the process is about, and give you some examples from my life, and talk about how we can really go through the process and work through the process of grieving in a way that is uh, more oriented toward completing the grieving process. So, first of all, what is grieving? Grieving, I would say, is the process of working through a perceived loss. So, some examples could be the death of a loved one, a breakup, loss of a job. Any of those are good candidates. So, there can be feelings, really deep feelings of sadness that accompany such losses. And if we don't go through the grieving process, then the end result can be depression. If you've read Conversations with God, the books by Neil Donald Walsh, in Book 3, Part 1, he talks about the 5 basic emotions, one of them being grief. And he talks about what happens if grief is not expressed and not really worked through, that it can lead to depression. So oftentimes people who are dealing with depression are really dealing with unresolved grief. So if depression is unresolved grief, then the question is how can we lift ourselves out of this, right? And another thing to be before I go there, it's like try to understand that it's like, well, how do we end up there, right? Why don't we just go through the grieving process and come to the completion of it and we're done? And the answer is that, we're really kind of wired to avoid bad feelings. So those deep feelings of sadness and loss are programmed into us as bad feelings, and it hits us in the gut. And it's like, I don't want to feel this, and so I'll do anything not to have to feel it. Some people turn to drugs or alcohol. Some people pretend that the feelings don't exist, and they don't really process through all the feelings and that kind of thing. And then, of course, when that happens, the end result is kind of the same thing. You end up with depression. Okay, so having said that, I'd like to tell you my experience of the grieving process. So my first real deep experience of grieving was a breakup. It was my first boyfriend, and it was one of those relationships that was, the first 6 months was great, the next 2 years was a bit rocky. And at the end of it, when it was finally kind of over and it was really just, it had struck home and it was like done, and now it was this just feeling in my heart of just my heart breaking. I spent days just crying, lying in bed, crying, not knowing what to do. And it was just the worst feelings I'd ever had. And then about the third day, I was walking, between the kitchen and the bedroom, and I suddenly had this one thought. Why am I crying over a relationship I say I don't want? I had broken up with him. So, inside my brain, suddenly my mind went short-circuited and went, this makes no sense. And the waterworks stopped. I completed with the crying, and it was just like, I had this real clarity about it. What I realized was, what the crying and the sadness and everything else, what I was feeling was all related to what I was telling myself about, if only it could have been, if only he had been, if only I had done, and all of this, if only, if only, if only. And what I realized was that what I was trying to do was keep alive this fantasy idea that it could have been different than the way that it was. And I suddenly realized, I'm like, it's been 2.5 years. He's probably not going to change. I'm really probably not going to change, unless something, like, people don't change unless they really choose to, or there's some really good motivation. And it was like, I was holding on to well, if only it could have been this other way. So I had this sort of dichotomy in my consciousness of the fantasy boyfriend that I wanted, fantasy relationship that I wanted, and then there was the relationship that I had. And when I looked at the relationship that I had that was not working, I'm like, no, I actually don't want that. And that sense of loss, that sense of deep, deep sadness over loss, suddenly just went away because I came into acceptance that the relationship I had was not something that I wanted and I could let it go. So grieving is really this process of just letting go. With my second boyfriend, um, during that breakup, now he broke up with me, and it was a little rough, but it was like at the point at which it happened, I had this first experience that I could bring to bear on the second experience. It did not make it any easier, but it did allow me to shorten the process because I was very clear inside myself that what I was doing was letting go of the fantasy. What I was grieving was the fantasy relationship. If only it could have been different. And I knew that I had to let go of that. So in that case, it took about 24 hours, which thankfully was shorter. I still had to go through it, and I did not avoid it. I knew that the way out was through it. I knew that the way to come and move past it, it's like I have to cry every tear. I have to allow myself to really have the feelings and feel them, but not to cycle through it over and over again, trying to keep that fantasy alive. My real intention was, okay, let's go through and just see what comes up as far as, what is it that my consciousness has had in terms of like our future life together and how that was supposed to be and all this stuff. And it's like, it's just a natural part of what we do, right? If I'm planning for tomorrow, if I'm planning for next year, I'm planning how my relationship is going to play out, right? I create this idea in my consciousness of how it's going to go. It's the creation of that idea that needs to be let go of at the point at which it's like, oh no, we're going this way. That relationship, it's not happening anymore. We're over here now, and I'm single again. That's my current life path. And I have to let go of the Mike who's in relationship. I would say, the next real loss that I had to deal with was the death of my mother. She had cancer for a number of years, and toward the end, it was very fast at the end. I was actually not on the mainland. I was in Hawaii at the time, and it was just so fast. I didn't even make it back to where she was living before she died. And it was one of those things where, in the process of all of it, again, I knew that I had to allow myself to feel the sadness. I had to allow myself to really go through the process of letting go, and really be in alignment with this was her life, right? And she chose to work with her cancer and go through the medical stuff that she did the way that she did it. And if I had any ideas about it should have gone down differently, it should have happened differently, if she'd have listened to me, she might live longer, anything like that, I knew I was sunk. So it was really just a process of letting the feelings come up, letting the sadness come up, and letting go of any notion that it should have been different than the way that it was. I'm going to, went to a funeral home to, there's a viewing of the body and that kind of thing, if, for people who have that as their religious practice. And I always thought it was kind of strange, like, why would you want to go and hang out for an afternoon with a dead body? But now it's like I understand that in doing that, it's like it really allows the consciousness to get clear on this person has passed, right? It's like, it's one of the things that allows us to let go of the fantasy that they're still alive, right? Because in my head, in my consciousness, I know this person is alive. And now seeing them lying here in a coffin, not moving, they are in fact not alive anymore. So, we would go to the funeral home and my siblings were kind of like, okay, game face on. We need to put on this facade that, things are okay and we're doing all right. And I was like, forget it. If I need to cry while I'm there, I will. I don't really care what other people think of me. I don't care what I look like. Whatever shows up in the moment, I allow myself to feel it and I allow myself to express. And in that process of expressing the sadness and just letting go and allowing the grief to work through, to me anyway, that helps to, I don't want to say shorten the process, but it's like it doesn't, perpetuate it and cause it to extend for a long time. Now, I was much more attached to my mother than, say, I might have been to the boyfriends because I knew her for over 40 years. I would say it took, about 10 days before, again, the waterworks stopped and I was really able to come into this place of acceptance with her death. And just, and I'm not to say that, at times in the future when I would think of her that there wasn't sadness that came up, but the real grieving, it had completed for me. And I just came into acceptance that, this was going to be life with my mother not present in the physical anymore. So in all of this, it's like, well, what is this grieving process? Well, the grieving process is one of letting go of the fantasy, right? When we grieve a loss, in order to have a loss, it's like I have this thing and now it's not there anymore, right? And that creates this schism in consciousness, right? So whatever it is, whether it's someone who was alive and now they're not, or someone who I was in a relationship with, now the relationship's not there, so I've lost the relationship, or a job, and now I don't have the job anymore, I was fired, the job's gone, that kind of thing. There's this like my consciousness and the way that things were going and the trajectory of my life, and then there's the way things are, and in that there's this split that occurs. So the grieving process is one of letting go of these ideas that life should be continuing the way that it was. And it allows me to go and see my life for what it is, come into acceptance with, here's my life without this person or this relationship or this job in it. This is what it's going to look like now. Now, knowing this does not make it any easier. The feelings are the same. You still have to cry every tear. When it's done, it's done. There's no real timeline for this. But knowing that what you are grieving is the fantasy, knowing that what you're grieving is the ideas of how it should have been, or what I thought it was going to be, what it could still be, that if I try to hope and keep that alive, it will just continue on and on and on and cycle. Right? And that can lead to depression. Letting go of that, going through the process of letting go and coming into acceptance with what is, allows my life to return to what it was. My natural state is one of joy and acceptance and loving and compassion. And so working through the negative feelings, working through the split in consciousness, allows me to return to my natural state, allows me to return to my own natural loving. So I hope this video is in some way helpful to you. If it is, feel free to share it with others. If it is not, then just let it go. If you disagree with what I've said or anything like that, that is just fine. It's meant to be instructional, it's meant to be helpful, but it is not meant to be the truth. It is just my way of looking at things. And I offer it as a way to assist people in perhaps working through those times of loss, and working through perhaps depression if you're still stuck in any of that. So take care, much love to you, and peace.